Hi and welcome to this video. So today I'm going to be talking about the 5 reasons why Africa as a continent is still struggling. I'm going to talk about this from the perspective of potential and performance because that's what I do. So looking at Africa as a collective, why we still struggle as a collective. Remember, as a collective, we're many people in a collective, okay? So for you to understand that, you've got to understand, number one, our history. A lot of people today have undermined the power, the effect, the impact of our history. And when I talk about history, I'm talking about slave trade and the impact of slave trade. So history is very important because if you can know the birth of a thing, then you can begin to understand where certain characteristics or where certain behaviors have been transferred over time. Okay, so the history of slave trade brought with it subjugation, it brought with it suppression, it brought with it the need to become somebody else or someone else that you weren't before. That is the power of slave trade, okay? Which meant that as Africans, especially West Africans who had huge impacts when it came to slave trade, as Africans, though as a collective, the impact of slave trade over history is huge. We need to understand that slave trade brought about deaths. Slave trade brought about the bleeding of Africa as a continent, the bleeding of her people into other continents. We need to understand one critical thing. Africa went through an immense level of trauma. It went through, I'm going to say it again, an immense level of trauma. Trauma on her people, suppression brought about trauma. Okay, taking off your right and your ability to talk, taking off your right and your ability to express yourself in your local language or who you were at the time brought about trauma. The stripping away of husbands and sons brought about trauma. Okay, so Africa as a continent, as a collective, suffered immense trauma. And so when we talk about trauma, what do we mean? A lot of us today talk about what we see in Africa. We use words like Africa is too corrupt, Africa is too backward, Africans don't live up to the Western way of living. You talk about the negatives you see in Africa. Those are just symptoms. You talk about greed in Africa. It is a symptom. It is not, it's just a symptom. It is not the main thing that is holding Africa back. It's a symptom of something deeper, something deep-seated, okay, in the spirit and the soul of the continent of Africa, okay? And it is trauma that is still being held, it's still being transferred from generation to generation, okay? In point 2, I'm going to talk a little bit more about trauma and intergenerational trauma. But before I get there, before I go to point 2, we need to go back and read the history of Africa. Slave trade started from the 16th century and ended in the 19th century. We're talking about 400 years of trauma. 400 years. So that's 100 years times 4 of trauma. And we're possibly talking about 5 generations or 6 or possibly 7 generations of trauma. Okay, so we need to understand that history. We need to understand what it ignited in the African person when it happened. When slave trade came to be, what did it ignite in the African person? We need to understand that. Okay, so what did it ignite? For example, it ignited the need to survive and not thrive because you needed to be like someone else. You needed to be like an European. You probably wore, then in those days, they would wear very, very thick clothes under the scorching heat. Okay, you would wear long sleeve dresses under the scorching heat. You would cover your whole body at times under the scorching heat. There was so much that happened. Culture became non-culture, and we had to buy into a new culture as a people. Okay, so there was stripping away, there was bleeding of people, there was, in terms of our ability to be intuitive, our ability to produce as a people, our ability to think as a people, our ability to collectively grow the continent as a people, that was stripped away from us. So if you understand the history of trauma over 400 generations, then you would understand point 2. So let's go to point 2.